introduce Derek Atkins, who's from Secure RF, who's talking about the Algebraic Eraser Public-Key Cryptography System.
Good morning, everybody, or actually, good afternoon. John, thank you, and the ShmooCon team for allowing me to speak here. I was told that I can't use the lavalier mic, so I'm going to be stuck right here, which I apologize for. I usually like to move around a little bit. So if I'm sort of wiggling in my stance here, that's why. My name is Derek Atkins. I'm going to speak to you a bit today about using the algebraic eraser and securing low-power and passive IoT devices. So first of all, what is the Internet of Things, or IoT? Here's a bunch of example devices that you may find. There's tons of other stuff out there. I just picked a random sampling, everything from bio devices to security devices to large format products and manufacturing, sensors, and basically it's anything that can help. It's an electronic device that's going to do a service or perform a function. So what all these devices have in common other than generally being electronic? Well, I'll give you one thing that they all have in common. In general, they all have limited computation and power resources. Many times they're often run on a battery. They have small CPUs or even dedicated controllers. They don't have the processor that my laptop or even my cell phone would have. So when we want to talk about securing these devices, what do we have to do? So let me actually step back even from that and talk about a real-world use case. So this is actually a problem that actually exists. So let's say you have some medical pharmaceuticals that are out there. They're in bubble packs. You get them through the supply chain, and you want to make sure that they're actually not counterfeit. They're actually authentic pieces of medication. So what do you have to authenticate them with? Well, let's for assumption, let's just say you have a cell phone to use to authenticate. And in this case, we're actually not considering the cell phone to be a constrained device, but what we are considering a constrained device is what you have to use to authenticate. So this is actually an NFC tag. That little black dot that's in the middle of that circle next to the quarter, that's the actual piece of silicon. That's the processor that you have. And you would take one of these tags and you would stick it to the pharmaceutical packaging in a way that it can't be removed, can't be copied, and obviously when you open up the medication, it destroys the tag. So now you can take your phone, put up the medication, verify that tag, and realize that it's actually an authentic or potentially not authentic piece of medication. So what we do is we would actually put our cryptography actually into that piece of silicon. So let's step a little bit forward now and say, okay, well, we have this problem that we're trying to solve. Well, how do you actually secure these devices that when you have such small power constraints, such small computation constraints? Well, you would think about, you can use AES or some other symmetric cipher. Those are relatively small. It was designed for small things. There's more things that are also similar. But unfortunately, these kinds of solutions require explicit key management. So you'd have to put keys into every device and every tag, and then you'd have to maintain databases of it and secure those databases, and every reader that's going to verify this has to have access to that secure database. And of course, if that data gets out, you can now forge a tag. So the solution is really to have a public key crypto systems. With public key, you have the ability to have a private and public key. There's two pieces that are related to each other. I'm sure you all know what that means. So, okay, great. We got lots of public key crypto systems out there. Why do we need to get another one? We've got RSA, we've got ECC, we've got Diffie-Hellman. What's wrong with these? They've been out there. They work really great. Well, the problem is all of these systems require too much time, too much power, too much CPU to run in these really, really tiny devices. I mean, that spec that I showed you on that other slide has such a small footprint to get down to that size. It just doesn't have the capability to run these devices. So let's say it does have an actual MCU on there. You can do this in software, but the software implementations of ECC, let alone RSA, are just way too slow. Humans have a small window of opportunity where they're willing to wait for something to occur, and when you run these algorithms at that speeds that are available to you, the human just is not willing to wait that long. They'll retry it, which begins the process all over again. So, okay, well, you can move it into silicon. Well, the problem is that the hardware required to implement RSA or ECC is just too much to put in these small devices. It just blows the cost out of the water. So it's not worth protecting a $10 piece of medication with a tag that costs you $5. It's just the cost-benefit analysis just doesn't work. So what we really need is a lightweight solution. And this is this is lightweight cryptography that we're talking about. It's something that can run efficiently in these small devices and provide the security necessary to provide these functions. So this is where the algebraic eraser comes into play, and that's what I'm going to be talking about the rest of this talk. So what is the algebraic eraser? Well, this is what I'm going to be talking about for the next, 45 minutes or so. So I'll give you a little bit of background on it, talk about math, and the math primer, giving you a little background of the math behind the algorithm. I'm going to talk about one construction that we've got, which is a Diffie-Hellman construction, and a security analysis of that Diffie-Hellman construction. And I've got a couple demonstrations that I'd like to give to you up here, which I've got set up, and then we'll talk about some conclusions at the end. So the algebraic eraser is a group theoretic public key algorithm. It was first introduced in 2005, published in 2006. It's been in a number of papers and programs throughout its history. And it's a lightweight quantum-resistant algorithm. And it's, one of the things we've been finding, it has significant performance gains over ECC. It's both in terms of running faster, requiring less power, less CPU, and lots of good things when we're talking about these small little devices here. One of the other interesting things about algebraic eraser is that it scales linearly as you increase the security level. So, and I'll get into more detail about why this is the case later in this talk, but basically what this means is that as you want to make it stronger, you just have to run it for a linearly longer time period. And that's not the case with other algorithms like RSA or Diffie-Hellman or ECC. With ECC, as you double security level, you have to run 4 or more times as much and the complexity of time. RSA is even worse than that. So one of the things about algebraic eraser was designed specifically with these small devices in mind. Things like RFID, Bluetooth, ASICs, systems on chips, these really small devices that don't necessarily have the processor power or the actual battery power lifetime to support these older, larger, more complex algorithms. The other thing about algebraic eraser, and I'll get into this a little bit later as well, is that there's multiple cryptographic constructions that we can make out of it. So it's a building block of pieces for which we can have different algorithms and crypto systems. So I mentioned group theoretic cryptography. This technology has been around for a while. It's been studied for a while. Here's a book that you can get from Amazon right now for $61. You can have it on Monday if you order it within a couple hours. It's actually a good book. I don't have a copy, but some friends of mine read it. And actually, they talk about our algorithm in here. So it's been studied and published in multiple places. So I want to get a little bit into the background of algebraic eraser. So to do that, I need to step back to some math. So hopefully this won't bore anybody. I'm sure a lot of people are interested in came to ShmooCon to get a good math lecture. So this is not it. I'm an engineer, not a mathematician. Basically, the background of algebraic eraser goes back to the theory of braids. Now, one thing I want to point out: this is not braid group cryptography. So if you look to if you're like a braids cryptography, oh, there's this braid group cryptography. Oh, that was broken. This is not braid group cryptography. That's something completely different. That is broken. This is something new. The difference is that braids here are just used as a construct to come up with some hard problems that we base it on. So braids were first introduced in 1921 by this guy named Artin. And if anyone has a woman in their life with long hair, or a man who has long hair, you've probably actually done braids yourself. You take different strands and cross them. So here's an example of a braid with 4 strands, and the strands cross over and under each other, and you come up with this geometric form. Obviously, there's many different geometric forms you can come up with, and you can add more crossings, and it just gets very, very complex very quickly. So the interesting thing about braids is that you can think of it as a math system, just like numbers or other things. So you can take two braids and you can multiply them. So the way you multiply two braids is that you can concatenate them. So you take two braids and you stuff them together, and you now have yet another braid, which is the first braid multiplied by the second braid. How cool is that? Like other math constructs, there's the identity element. So you have if you take a braid and multiply it by the identity element, you get that same braid. So not surprisingly, the identity element of a braid is a braid that has no crossings at all. And when you take any braid and multiply it by the identity, either in front or the back, you get the same braid out. Braids also have inverses. The inverse of a braid is when you multiply it by the inverse, you get back to the identity. So let's say you have a braid here, and you have a second braid, which is the inverse, and if you multiply them together, which I actually don't have a picture of, I'm afraid, you can then basically pull the strands apart one by one, and each crossing has a crossing that is backwards to it, and at the end you'll have straight lines through. It becomes in the identity element. So this is all fun and interesting. Let's break down braids even more. So this is where our team comes interesting, is that when you have a braid based on all these different strands, you can break it down into single crossings. So any braid can be based upon its single crossings. So basically you have what are called braid generators. So you have the first braid generator B1, where you have the first strand crosses over the second, B2, second crosses over third, and B3, third crosses over the fourth. And of course, because every braid has an inverse, you could do the reverse. So B1 inverse is 2 crossing back over 1. Now, the thing that's interesting is that which braid strand is crossing over or under actually matters here. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you start about the complexity of these braids, is that it's not just a question of which strands are crossing, but in which order they're crossing. So whether it's crossing this way or crossing that way actually matters. Other thing about braids is that there's a number of braid relations that work in these generators. And I'm just going to go through this a little quickly. So basically, when you have three crossings, where you have a braid crossing the next one over and the back, that's equivalent to if you swap them around and have the second one, the first one, second one. So for example, B1, B2, B1 equals B2, B1, B2. The other thing that's interesting is that if you have braids that are not next to each other, then you can actually go back and forth across them in either order. So here's a picture of that first one, and that when you have the braids crossing, it winds up being the same thing, and you can basically follow the braids, and you'll see that there actually are the same braids. And for the second one, when they don't actually cross themselves at all, they're not next to each other, doesn't matter which order you do the operations in, it's actually still the same braid. So braids is not just the crossings, not just the structure. Braids also have permutations. So basically, when you have a braid and you have the crossings, you basically have braids starting at the beginning. That you can imagine that they're tied to some post-its that are stuck in, and then you take the braids to go down. They do the crossings, and the question is where do they wind up at the end, and that's your permutation. So in this particular braid, you have a permutation where each braid winds up going down to itself. So you have you follow 1 down, it goes to number 2. 2 comes down and goes to number 3. 3 comes down and goes to number 4, and 4 comes down and goes to number 1. So that would be the permutation of this particular braid. So this is also going to come into play because it's not just the structure, but also the permutation that matters. So there's also this concept called pure braids. So we talked earlier about the identity braid. A pure braid is a braid that is not straight. It actually has real crossings, but still has a trivial permutation. So if you have this braid here, if you notice how each strand, if you follow it through, it ends up in the exact same place where it started from, but you can't pull the braid apart like you can to get to the identity. So that's the concept of a pure braid. So when I first started this company, I had never heard of braids before. It's not something I ever studied in any of my engineering or math classes when I went to school. So it was completely new to me. And one thing that was trying to get through my head is, okay, I got these pretty pictures that they're drawing for me. I work in computers, I work in engineering. Show me the numbers. How does this actually work into numbers? So this is where the color bureau matrices and e-multiplication come into play. So you take this nice mathematical construct of braids, and now we're going to actually convert it into numbers that computers can operate on. And the way we do that is that every braid generator converts into a specific matrix and a permutation. So basically, we can take this association, and which I'll show you an example. So you basically what we have is a color bureau matrix. So basically, based upon the braid generator, it fills in a matrix in a specific form. So every generator has a single known matrix of a specific form that you can now apply to a mathematical function. And of course, there's the inverse of that as well. So when you have the first braid generator or the inverse braid, you have a specific matrix that forms out. And these TIs that you see there are actually variables. So it's a variable that you plug in. So based upon that, we have this concept called e-multiplication that we've come up with. So e-multiplication is a one-way function. So it takes a matrix and a permutation, and then applies a braid generator or a series of them, and with its associated permutation, and the end result is another matrix and permutation. And this is the building blocks for all the algebraic eraser constructions. So basically, you start with a braid group, Bn. So that's a braid on n strands. I've been showing you instances of B4. So that's a braid group with 4 strands. We have a finite field of Q elements. So this could be a binary field. It could be a prime field. When you talk about ECC, you think of P256. It's a prime field with 256 bits. The fields here are much, much smaller. We're actually doing 8 bits or less in these fields. And then we have a set of t-values. So t-values is just an array of numbers within that finite field, 1 per braid strand, and those equate into those TIs that I showed you on the previous slide. And what we do is we fill those in. I'll show that in a bit. So basically, these t-values give an action on the symmetric group, on the permutation group. So basically, given a function, when you have those TIs, you can apply the t-values, and you actually get some numbers out instead. So I'll get to that in a second as well. So the interesting thing is that e-multiplication can be iterative. Wow, I'm guessing boring some people. They're walking out on me. Like I said, I'm an engineer, not a mathematician. My mathematicians make this much more interesting than I can. So e-multiplication is something that can be iterated. So you have a whole braid, you have all these generators, you do it one step at a time, so each step is a single e-multiplication. And so you can basically find out that, you just keep on going through this, and there's a bunch of math that you can look at later. But because of this, it's rapidly computable. So one of the things you may have noticed, but I'll point out now, is that color bureau matrix is a sparse matrix. There's only one entry in there that is not identity and not 0. Actually, sorry, it's 2. So it's basically the identity matrix, which you don't have to do anything for, because the identity matrix multiplying into a matrix is just itself. So the only thing you have to do is deal with those couple of entries that are not the identity. So it makes it very easy to write code that can actually compute a single e-multiplication. So this is showing the mathematics of an e-multiplication. Let me actually give you a concrete example, because I don't work well in math variables. I'm sure a lot of you don't either. So let me give you an actual example here. So using in B4, so you get a 4x4 matrix. Let's use F7 because it's a nice, even, nice, small prime. So if you just start with this matrix and that permutation, and I just chose some random t-values of 2, 4, 6, and 3. And now you want to apply the braid generator B2. So the way you do that is you apply the permutation and the t-values to the color bureau matrix. So there's the color bureau matrix that you get for B2. When you apply the t-values and the permutation, that's the result you get. You see there's a lot of zeros in there, and just mostly the identity matrix, so actually it winds up being very easy to compute this. So when you multiply that through within the F7, you wind up getting this new matrix, and again, you apply the permutation, you get a new permutation out of it as well. There we go. We've just done e-multiplication. Obviously, this grows bigger and bigger as you get to larger and larger braid groups. So I mentioned earlier that we have these t-values, and they're actually being plugged into these variables. Well, what happens is if you didn't do that, you wind up getting these large Laurent polynomials. So here's a short random word. If you have, let's assume you have a braid of just 10 crossings, and using B4. So basically, that's the result of the equation that you would get. So this is actually what e-multiplication is erasing, hence why it's called algebraic eraser. So we're basically erasing all that complexity and just plugging in numbers, which makes it much easier to compute. But if you didn't have those variables to plug in, you'd have to be computing all this. And this is only 10. Now imagine it going out to 1,000. So as I mentioned, e-multiplication is a one-way function that's being used to construct lots of different algorithms. The first one here I want to talk about is the Algebraic Eraser Diffie-Hellman algorithm. This is the one that's been out there for a long time. This is the first one out there. So everyone, I'm sure, is aware of what Diffie-Hellman is. So I'm just going to specifically talk about the AEDH protocol. So you have a public system-wide information, which is your BN and your FQ. We need a seed matrix, M0, which is just a matrix that you use. You then have two sets of commuting conjugates. So these conjugates are actually braids of specific forms. So you have the A side and the B side. And they're actually designed in such a way such that they commute. And as I showed earlier, the way you do that is you just have them from different sides of the braid group such that one side uses one, one's the other, and because they're not crossing each other, if they're not next to each other, they can commute. And then after you create these conjugates and rewrite them, you then destroy Z and you move on. So once you have the system-wide parameters that are generated, you then create, one person, Alice, creates a set of t-values, and then they generate their public key pair from that. So how does Alice do that? Well, they start by choosing a random matrix as a polynomial in that seed matrix. So they have the seed matrix that was generated earlier. They then generate a random polynomial and create a new matrix as a sum of it. So this winds up being M0 plus M0 squared plus M0 to the third with random multiplies in front. So the next thing Alice does is chooses a random word in those sets of conjugates that are associated to Alice. So this and this is can be as many as they want, but because e-multiplication is linear, this actually is affecting how fast the algorithm is going to run. And then she creates her public key by using e-multiplication. So she just takes her private key data that she started with, her matrix MA, and her word, and now can e-multiply it out, and she gets a public key, which is basically just a matrix and a permutation. And then she just sends that value and the t-values over to Bob. And Bob just does the exact same thing, using the exact same steps to convert his public key, and then sends that back to Alice. So that's great. So now Alice and Bob each have each other's public key, and they have their own private data, and from there they can compute their shared secret. This is Diffie-Hellman after all. So they actually take the public key of the other side, multiply it by their matrix, and then they use e-multiplication to go over their private braid, and it turns out that these wind up being exactly the same to each other, specifically because the braids were set to commute. If they were not commuting objects, then this would not work. If the matrices are not the same, it doesn't work. If the t-values are not the same, it doesn't work. So you need a lot of things to be distributed the same for this math to work. But it's specifically because it's actually chosen to commute. That was the main thing. Now, one thing I want to point out right now is that there's lots of different architectures and deployment scenarios that I'm not talking about today that have different processes and characteristics. I'm just focusing on this one because it is the original and it's the one that has been the most studied. And I'll talk a little more about some of the alternate ones we have as well when I get to the demonstrations. But they're all different ones with different characteristics. For example, you can convert into an LGML form where one person has, where basically Alice sends everything out to Bob, including conjugates in real time, and and changes on every transaction. So let me go talking about the attacks and the security analysis. Basically, since it's been published in 2006, there have been 3 attacks on Algebraic Eraser, other than the brute force attacks. Obviously, brute force is the easiest, but there's 3 that go beyond that. The first one is an attack that tries to discover the secret conjugator. The second attack is actually trying to recover part of the public key. And the third attack, which was just published last November, is actually a target attack that actually tries to recreate the shared secret. Now, I'm going to go into more detail on some of these, so let me start. So let me go into the first attack. So that first attack is trying to find that secret conjugator Z. So basically, what it's doing is it's taking the 2 sets of conjugates, which are the form Z, alpha I, and Z inverse, and Z beta J, Z inverse, for Alice and Bob sets conjugates, and using that data, it tries to recover Z. Basically, what they did here is that they actually took conjugates that are way smaller and reduced the size so that they make their attack work. Basically, if you make the conjugates the size, appropriate size, which is what we had done originally, their attack fails. This is sort of like trying to use Fermat's factoring theorem to factor RSA keys. Well, yeah, if I make an RSA key that's only 100 bits long, I can certainly use Fermat's factoring theorem to factor it, but as soon as you get up to 1,000 bits, Fermat's theorem doesn't work anymore. It just falls apart. So this is the same thing here. If you make the conjugate data small enough, which is what they did, then their algorithm works. But as soon as you make it up to reasonable sizes, it doesn't work anymore. And if you're interested in the refutation there's the URL to the paper that actually talks about this attack and how it doesn't apply. So the second attack is actually trying to find the private matrix. Well, this attack is a little more interesting and a little more involved. So it's actually a linear algebra attack. I'm not sure how many people took linear algebra. Last time I actually studied it was about 25 years ago. But basically what it's doing is you have a bunch of equations and a bunch of unknowns, and once you have enough equations and enough unknowns, you can basically force out an answer. So what they're doing is they're basically making spurious braids and using those braids to come up with these sets of equations such that the matrix must actually satisfy these equations. But to actually make their attack work, they assumed that that seed matrix was generated randomly, and that was not the case, and is not the case. So basically, instead of creating a random braid, you can take a pure braid, which, as I said, is a braid that has lots of crossings, but the permutation is the identity permutation, and you can use that to generate your seed matrix M0. And then once you do that, whenever you create a public key based matrix based upon that, of that form, which is what we said earlier, then actually any result of this equation satisfies the equations that they said before, so it winds up being, it doesn't help them anymore, but it winds up returning back to brute force. And again, the paper for this is also listed there. So for those 2 attacks, I'm just summarizing them. For this next attack, because it was only published it was published in November, and we have a refutation paper that's coming out next week. But I'm going to spend a little more time on this other attack because it's much more recent. So this is the BBT attack that came out last November, and what they are claiming is that they can compute the shared secret based upon a lot of public information. So what they can do is, if you have knowledge of both public keys, the T values, the seed matrix, which I forgot to put in here, and one of the sets of conjugates, using all that data, you can then do a lot of pre-computation and then eventually compute the shared secret. So really what they're doing is factorizing the key. So they're taking the original key, which would be PRNG, which would be Bob's public key. It's a matrix and a permutation. And what they're doing is they're finding another matrix and another braid that wind up producing the same public key. They're not actually finding Bob's private data. They're not finding his private matrix. They're not finding his private braid. They're actually finding another matrix and another braid that happens to turn into the same public key. And it turns out that based on this, they can actually use that factorized key to create the same shared secret. So once they actually compute all that stuff, they can then create the shared secret of this form right here. Basically, they're plugging in Alice's public key into this equation to make the math work. So how does this attack actually work? So the first thing they do is they take Bob's conjugates and have to compute a set of pure braids. So they have a conjecture that they can do this relatively easily using random distributions. But there's a lot of work involved here in doing that, and takes up a lot of the time. Then once they had that done, they take the conjugates and pure braids, and they find simple transpositions and permutation generators. So what they want to do is they want to find these, using what combinations of conjugates and these pure braids can find a single crossover on a braid in the permutation. And then they can use those simple ones to build up whatever permutation you wind up having. The next thing they have to do is they have to take those pure braids and the t-values for the transaction and compute a full vector space, which is a ton of matrices, and then using all those matrices, they have to find the basis. So this is, again, all this is a lot of work. And then what they have to do is once they actually see the key that's being generated and used for that particular transaction, they have to figure out what sets of conjugates are being used and apply them all in order to get the factorization of the key. So all that being said, what does this mean? Well, first of all, most of this running time is their work finding V, and they claim in their attack that their running time of this is order n to the fifth and space n to the third, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually winds up being, it still is a lot of work. And basically, again, as I said again, this is just finding the pseudo key that can create that shared secret. It's not actually finding Alice's or Bob's private data. So how can we defeat this attack? Well, first of all, as I said, the attacker needs a lot of data for this attack to work. They need the conjugates, they need the t-values, they need the matrix, they need both public keys. So preventing access to any one of these pieces of data makes the attack fail. And there are certainly many deployment architectures where that's the case. We can, in fact, in their original paper that they published in November, they reference an ISO specification that we're working on, where in one of the profiles in that, we actually have the public keys are not actually being transferred across the air. So the attacker does not have access to one of the public keys, so the attack doesn't even work in that profile. So the other thing is that when you change the conjugates or the t-values in any way, the results in a new vector space, and they have to perform all that work again. So in their paper, they're talking about all this pre-computation they can do. Well, that works great if there is pre-computation. If you're doing an ML type model, for example, every transaction you get a new set of conjugates, and so they have to do all that work all over again. So again, there's different architectures where the attack doesn't work. The other thing is that if you increase the braid size, it increases the time and storage required by the attacker. So you can make the attack effectively infeasible by going to larger braids. But most importantly, their attack is based on a conjecture. And the conjecture is that it's possible to generate these short expressions of the conjugates to generate fine pure braids. And we've actually found a counterexample. So a conjecture is just a statement that has no proof behind it. So for example, it rained here in DC yesterday. So I can make the conjecture, since I was here yesterday, gee, it must rain in DC every day. Well, it's a conjecture. It's not, maybe it's raining today. I don't know. I'm sitting inside a building. But, all you need is one counterexample to show that that conjecture is false. So we actually found one, and here it is. So basically, we have these permutations. As you see, it's a series of cycles. So each CP and C'P is a cycle of prime length in a permutation. And each of these cycles are disjoint. They have the same fixed points, and they're not a power of each other. And please don't ask me what that means, because I have to go back and call my mathematicians, and they don't like being called on Saturdays. But basically, when you have this type of permutation set up, you can actually generate these, and you can choose them randomly. It's not that hard to choose them randomly once you have that, and to find them to have these properties. And then what happens is these permutations actually live in a group that has an extremely high order. And what that means is that it requires a significant number of conjugates to actually get back to a simple permutation. And basically, they're conjecturing that you can do it always in n or less. So if you're working in braid group B16, for example, they say they always require at least, at most 16 elements to find back to a pure braid. And in this particular case, that's not the case. This is working in a much bigger braid group, of course, but it requires significantly more than that number of conjugates to get back to a pure braid. So basically, their conjecture is actually failing here. So actually, let me give you a couple demonstrations of our technology. This is a cool conference. So the first one I want to talk about is a demonstration on a micro-semi board. Unfortunately, the cable here is relatively short, so I can't. People on that side are probably not going to be able to see it very well. So this is a micro-semi FPGA that has an ARM built into it. So it's a combination of fabric and software. So basically, what this has on it is a combination of algebraic eraser and elliptic curve. So they're both in hardware sitting next to each other. So what I'm going to do is do a side-by-side comparison of the speed of algebraic eraser and ECC. So what I'm going to do in a second is I'm going to start the test. And what you'll see is that it's going to draw a picture per authentication. So every line in the picture is a single authentication that's being completed. So it goes back to goes to the board, it does an authentication, draws a line in the photo, draws a line in the picture, and goes back. And it's doing this in parallel to each other. So it's not. So there's actually two processes. It's actually two processes running side by side. So let me go start that. Don't blink. So the test is still running, as you can see on the right-hand side. So it completed that algebraic eraser. This is actually 512 authentications. There's 512 lines in this photo. So it did the 512 authentications using algebraic eraser in 37 milliseconds. That winds up being about 72 microseconds per authentication. ECC on the same system is taking 370 milliseconds per authentication. So I'll let you guys do the math of how much faster algebraic eraser is than ECC. But what I want to point out is that not only is it a speed difference here, but speed equates to power consumption as well. So we're using about 400 times less power than ECC in this implementation. Guys want to see that again? Okay, I'm going to do it again. Don't blink. Ready? There we go. So that's the fun one. So let me give you a second one. So I'm holding an NFC card. It actually has a contact on this side, but that's actually turned off. This is a very, very low power NFC. It actually has an 8051 processor in it, which is a low power 8-bit controller. I think it maybe has a K of RAM. Actually has a lot of flash, so it has a lot of storage on this device. So you can imagine that this is actually just a different form factor for that tag that I showed at the beginning of the page. So that little tag with that little dot's actually in here. Most of what's in this card is an antenna for power. So actually, I use this to work. This is one of my ID badges. And what I have on this card is, there's algebraic eraser. So it's implemented actually in software on this card. It's not in the silicon itself. And I also have a certificate and some other data. So I've got my cell phone here. This is just a standard off-the-shelf HTC Android phone. You can go to any Sprint store and could have bought it. Oop, wrong one. Go there. And of course, requires specific placement. There we go. So what just happened, and I can do it again just in case you missed it this time again. It read the certificate. There's actually a certificate on here. It read the certificate off the card. and read onto the phone and validated the certificate. It then did an algebraic eraser, so it created a public key in real time, sent the public key down to here. It did a computation, sent back saying, here's my, lost my power. Here's my authentication token. Sent it back to the phone, so that's why it says authentic over here, because it actually verified that's the result, the shared secret it's supposed to have retrieved. And then it drew a picture, which it actually pulled off the card. One thing you should notice is that my phone's in airplane mode. So all this is actually being done between the phone and the card. So it's not going back to a database somewhere. It doesn't have to look up anything, off the internet. This is all being done, purely between the phone and the card. So who wants to see that one again? So why is it algebraic eraser so fast? Well, one thing is, as I mentioned earlier, ECC, RSA, and Diffie-Hellman, they're all multiplying very, very large numbers. With ECC, you're talking about 256-bit primes, or more. With RSA, you're talking 2,000-bit numbers. Diffie-Hellman, even that size or larger as well. The problem is that as your processors get smaller, the amount of work you have to do those computations actually grows, because you have to break them up into smaller and smaller pieces and put them back together. So as your processors get smaller, there's more of those multiple part steps you have to do, which makes the work that you have to do much harder. So as I mentioned earlier, e-multiplication is generally working in these small fields. In particular, I think we're using a field of 32 on here, so it's literally a 5-bit field that we're doing. So because it's an 8-bit processor, you can do that in single steps. It's easy to do a multiplication, or actually we can just do a lookup in a lookup table. And so it makes it really, really fast. And as I mentioned earlier, as I showed you with the e-multiplication, you're only doing a couple of multiplications. So you're really doing a multiplication and a subtraction per row. And you can do that basically based on the length of the braid. So it winds up being very, very fast. So the runtime of e-multiplication, as I just said, it's based on the length of that braid. So granted, as the braid goes longer, you have more multiplications you have to do. That really controls how long your authentication is going to take. But because each step in the multiplication is so fast and takes up so little time and effort, it still winds up being significantly faster than any of these other algorithms, even when we're doing thousands of multiplications. The other thing, as I mentioned, is this braid is growing linearly as you increase the security level. So to increase the security level, you just have to combine more of those conjugates together as you're creating your key. And so that winds up making your braid grow linearly as you get more. So if you want to go from one security level to another security level, it winds up effectively doubling the length of your braid. So you wind up doubling the amount of effort that you're expending. So the other thing about algebraic erasers, as I said, we have multiple protocols we can do. It's all based on e-multiplication. So one thing we also have, we have a hash function. We have a paper that was accepted to a math publication several months ago. Who knows when that's actually going to get published? But if you're interested, I can certainly send it to you. But it's using e-multiplication and braids to take it as a hash function. And the interesting thing about this particular hash function is actually a hash family. So you can actually create a random hash on the fly just by changing which order of braids you have in your settings. And there's also some tweaks you can do in terms of speed versus effort and storage. So there's a lot of interesting tweaks. The other thing, we actually ran some statistical analysis on this based on NIST's random number tests, what they do to generate and test randomness. And it worked out that this actually performed as good, if not slightly better, than dev random in a couple of tests, which I found surprising. But so we think this works pretty well. We've got a block cipher. It's just it was an interesting concept in the construction. So that's there. You can also, using the similar concept to the way the hash works, we can do a PRNG and create a pseudo-random generator, and from there actually create a stream cipher. We also have a digital signature algorithm. We're working on a paper on that as well, which we're hoping to send to the crypto conference. So if you're on the crypto PC, watch out for that. It'll be coming. Interesting thing about this is that unlike ECDSA, verification of AEDSA signatures is extremely fast. In fact, it's actually faster by a factor of about 2 than the Diffie-Hellman that I just showed you. So if you want to actually validate certificates on these low-end devices now, you can do it with an AEDSA signature, and it'll validate extremely quickly. Whereas ECC on this takes, the best algorithm for ECC takes approximately 1.5 seconds for a single point multiplication. And since elliptic curve digital signature is 2 for validation, so it's at least 3 seconds to validate a signature on this card in the best algorithm you can possibly find. So I'm not actually going to go into details of these today, just because I'm almost out of time. So I'm just going to do a quick conclusion. So we think that this is a novel public key model. It solves a lot of problems for these small constrained devices. I think it's certainly, as we showed you, significantly faster than ECC, RSA, and Diffie-Hellman. It scales linearly as opposed to quadratically as you increase the security, so it makes it easier to do that. The underlying core technology can be used to form different constructs, and it's quantum resistant. We have a paper on that as well we can describe. And it has a small footprint in hardware and software implementation, so again, it fits on these really small constrained devices. So we think this has a big future. So thank you, and I'm here to take questions. I think we have about 5 minutes or less. Your hand went up quickly, so.
How does its performance compare to a similar implementation of Simon or SPEC?
So the question was, how does this compare to Simon or SPEC? Well, Simon or SPEC are actually block ciphers, not public key. So you can't really. So it's really hard to compare them because it's like comparing apples and kumquats. So they're performing very different things. So. I haven't done that, so I don't have numbers on our block cipher versus that. Sorry, we've been focusing on the public key side of things, and the hash, not on block cipher. Yes. What is the license on this? It is patented technology currently. The actual license that we would provide to you is going to be based on what you want to do with it. But we want the technology to get out there, so we do not want to be an impediment. So we will work with you to make sure that the license works for whatever you want to do. God, lots of hands. Sorry.
Yeah, it's been broken several times. Why do you think it's going to be broken again?
Well, so that's a good question. The question was, it's been broken many times. Why do you think it won't be broken again? Well, I'll stand by and say it hasn't been broken many times. The first 2 attacks specifically used data that we were not using. So they basically created a construct based on the math that actually worked for their attack. So in the first case, they used really, really small keys, which was much smaller than what we even proposed. In the second case, they're using random data as opposed to data of specific form. So it's like saying, well, gee, if I create an RSA key of 2 random numbers I just happen to create, whether or not they're primes, who cares? Well, it's insecure. Well, yeah, of course. So those first 2 attacks don't count. Only the most recent attack is more interesting. And do we think it's going to get broken? Do you think there's going to be more attacks? I don't know. I mean, that's the whole thing. But if you think about it, ECC and RSA also had similar things when they first came out too. There were lots of attacks against ECC, lots of attacks against RSA when they were first published. I'm sorry?
There were no attacks against authorization or CSP.
And there's been no attacks based upon the conjugation separation search problem that were based on the Ray group either. So we can talk afterwards. Sorry, either one. I don't care.
So in that visual test with the 2 applications and hardware, what are the security levels?
Yes, they're both using 128-bit. That was ECDH. So it's comparing apples to apples. So it was using Algebraic Eraser Diffie-Hellman to elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. Behind the light, I apologize, it's hard to see you, it's right where the light is.
As we see a lot in this industry, obviously there's theoretical attacks and there's practical attacks on applications. Is your implementation of those, or will it be open
So let me try and paraphrase that question. There's a difference between theoretical and practical attacks, and the question was about whether our implementation is closed or will be open. Currently, our implementation is closed, so all the attacks are theoretical against them. There are other implementations that are actually out there. The Stevens Institute, who did that first attack, actually wrote a bunch of code, and they've published it on the web, so you can actually get the code for it from them. So you can actually have the full implementation out there. We do plan to have a reference implementation that we put out there, but we have not done so yet. But it is in our plan. You and then you.
So you said that the BBC attack was grounded in this conjecture that it's possible to leverage the rate relations to get short expressions for chosen conjugates. And I guess I'm still a little baffled by the counterexample because I don't understand. I haven't read the paper, but I don't understand if the conjecture is supposed to apply in the general case or in every case. It seems like it's just supposed to apply almost always. Then what we've got is like the inverse of a weak key problem, right? Where just because you can select an example of conjugates that's known to make those relations doesn't mean that generally shows the conjugates will have the same property.
So I'm not going to be able to paraphrase that, so I apologize. Basically there's a bunch of conjectures in their paper. So it's not just one. I just pointed out to one that we have a counterexample for. There are actually several. Basically, the whole paper is based on conjecture, and there's multiple conjectures in there. So basically what they say is that in the general case, they can find these short expressions in the conjugates, but basically in the general case. What we found is that you can generate conjugates in such a way that that's not the case. So when you do that, and there's there's an infinite number of conjugates that actually meet that. So it's like, okay, yes, it's another class of weak keys, or weak data. Just like you can find weak ECC curves. You can go find ECC curve that's really weak. It's effectively the same thing here. You can find conjugate data that is weak enough to be subject to the BBT attack. If you form your conjugate data in this way, it's not subject to that attack. And you. So that it's basically going to depend on many things. So it's going to depend upon what BN you're talking about and what FQ you're talking about, and also how long your Z is and how long the conjugates are, which are so it's not just, there's a lot of tweaks that go into that. I can tell you in the braid that was on here is approximately 2,500 generators. You.
What specific property of demultiplication makes it quantum resistant?
Okay. So it basically we have a paper on it which I can get to you to specifically go. So basically the question was what about e-multiplication? Oh, I'm being told to stop. Can I answer this question first? Okay. So the question was, what about e-multiplication makes it quantum resistant? The answer is I can't tell you very well because I'm not the mathematicians. But basically, it's not subject to Shor. In fact, we talked to Peter Shor, and he has no idea how to apply his algorithm to this. It would be subject to Grover, but everything's subject to Grover. So because we're linear, you just have to make it twice as hard, and it becomes twice as hard for them. Versus for ECC, you have to make it 4.5 times as hard. And we go through a bunch of conjecture, basically a bunch of quantum analysis of the different known attacks and how none of them actually apply. So in particular, like the abelian hidden subgroup problem doesn't apply because braids are actually non-abelian. So that's one of the interesting things about this is that it's non-abelian math as opposed to abelian math. So a lot of the quantum algorithms don't apply. So I've been told I have to stop, so I'm happy to take more questions. Thank you.